Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what distinguishes monastics from lay people?
This is an interesting question. In my experience, there is always some sort of ritual where one gives up their loyalty to their country, their family, or their rulers, after which they profess their loyalty and devotion to the Buddha. Their lifestyle afterward reflects that. They'll dress differently, spend their day differently, and live differently. Lay people who have not done that will still be devoted to the Buddha, but in a different capacity.
Does that mean that monastics are regarded as morally better or more advanced than lay people?
Sometimes, but not necessarily. Sometimes it can simply be that monastics and lay people are choosing different means of pursuing the Buddhist path, or monastics can be exerting themselves so that lay people don't have to. Of course, monastics have specific rules about how they ought to act, but how many rules and how strict they are varies.
Fascinating. So monastics are still people, still sentient beings, but their status has changed somewhat.
Exactly.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing lay and monastic Buddhism. Shout out to Garret for asking, what is the difference between a lay person and a monastic in Buddhism? How does this difference affect duties and roles? How does this difference shift and change over time? We hope you enjoy. So, thanks again to Garret for asking, what is the difference between a lay person and a monastic in Buddhism?
This is an interesting question because it can be considered on several levels. Today we're going to be discussing it in three contexts: practical, cosmological, and ritual. In these three contexts, there is also the other dimension, which is history. This distinction of lay versus monastic goes all the way back to the very beginnings of Buddhism in India, and it shifts, changes, and evolves in all three contexts. As time passes, as Buddhism travels to various regions of Asia, and as doctrines get reimagined and reinterpreted, this also changes. History aside, the distinction between lay and monastic itself is a distinction that religious studies scholars also spend a lot of their time trying to understand and make sense of. There is an obvious divide that has external indicators like clothing, lifestyle, status within the organization of a religion, etc. But the internal indicators are much harder to get a read on, so we will try to hash some of that out here. In the practical context, the distinction between lay and monastic people in Buddhism is intuitive. Lay people don't do a lot of the stuff that monastics do, and vice versa. As in other religions, there are rules, forms, and observations that monastic people must keep, while lay people are not required to do so. Let's start with early and Theravada Buddhism, where there is a whole basket of the Tripitaka called the Vinaya Pitaka that concerns what monastics must and must not do, and there are considerable portions of the Sutta Pitaka that discuss those topics as well. There are rules dictating how monastics are to dress, eat, sleep, meditate, and live their lives in general. There are prohibitions that would simply not be reasonable for a layperson to observe. For example, monks and nuns are not allowed to keep or store food or seeds. They must subsist on alms given by lay people. They're not allowed to touch or handle or keep money. They're not allowed to sleep on an elevated bed. They're not allowed to eat after noontime. They're not allowed to listen to music or dance. They're not allowed to wear perfumes or rich or highly decorated clothing. On and on it goes. All these rules are called the pratimoksha, or the practices for moksha, or liberation from samsara. There are 227 of them for monks and 311 of them for nuns, with the extra rules for nuns pertaining to the fact that women menstruate, or otherwise just punishing them for men leering at them lustfully.
We've talked about this in previous episodes. In short,
The rules can be incredibly strict. A monk must not touch a woman, must not keep an extra robe for more than 10 days at a time, must not destroy plants, must not take boat trips with nuns, etc. Many of the nun-specific rules are also very sexist and draconian. They include rules against taking alms food from a man who is lusting after them, speaking with a man at night without a light source present, bathing naked, etc. I'll include a link to the full list for both monks and nuns in the show notes. There are only 10 rules that a layperson must follow as opposed to these 227 or 311, and these are the 10 precepts that we've discussed before. These are the most important 10 moral exhortations in all of Buddhism, and all of the 227 or 311 monastic rules follow from these 10, but the 10 are presented as guiding moral precepts or principles, whereas the 227 and 311 are hard rules, the violation of which could lead to disrobing and dismissal from a monastery. The trade-off for following all of these rules is an improved cosmic standing, so let's look at the differences in the cosmological context. Because these rules are hard to follow, all while carrying out day-to-day rituals, meditations, and services to the lay community, the payoff is huge. Even in early and Theravada Buddhism, monks or nuns can be living arhats or bodhisattvas. In other words, they can be enlightened beings whose future nirvana or future Buddhahood is guaranteed. We've talked about the 6 and 10 realms of transmigration in samsara before. Remember that in the formulation of the 6 realms, all human beings are grouped into one realm. Later on, because of the idea that enlightened beings are extraordinary and are unlike anybody else, the expanded 10 realms scheme places even arhats in a higher class than the gods, the asuras, and also the humans. That is why people willingly subject themselves to these strict and sometimes unfair rules and difficult practices. That's also why later Mahayana thinkers are critical of the whole morality system in early and Theravada Buddhism. We'll discuss this more in the third question, but they claim these rules are too hard to follow for the average person, and thus too exclusive. In other words, the Mahayana critique is that in the early Buddhist scheme, there must be a lay-monastic divide because the lay have to feed the monastics. If there were only monastics in the world, who would grow the food? Who would shovel the waste out of the streets? Who would reproduce to keep the population going? The Mahayana thinkers say that they are policing too many details and too many aspects of their daily lives for what is ultimately a global dead end. The path may result in a few arhats becoming enlightened and reaching nirvana, but it really just isn't a viable option for most people, or so they say. The next context in which we must think of the lay-monastic distinction is the ritual. Religion is a matter of what people do, not just a matter of what they believe, how they dress, what their identity is, etc. Actions are where the distinction between lay and monastic becomes very clear and intuitive. Let's consider a sutta reading ritual, where a monk or a group of monks reads a passage from a sutta to the assembled lay public. The divide here is super obvious. The keepers of the contents of the sutta are the monastics, and they read it for the benefit of the lay people. The ritual is for the continued turning of the Dharma wheel, for the merit gained by repeating the teaching and further cementing it in one's heart and mind. But it is also an act of generosity on the part of the monastics for the sake of the lay people. Just as the lay people give alms food, the monastics in return fulfill religious services and give subsistence back to the lay people in that way. This understanding of the lay and monastic roles and rituals is something that remains fairly consistent in Buddhism even as time goes on, as we will soon discuss. In addition to the 3 contexts we've just described, one of the internal indicators that underlies the distinction is the motivation or the devotion to the Buddha and the Dharma. This is a much harder thing to get a read on and is especially messy over time. But the idea is that whatever motivates a person to renounce and become a monk or nun is something that the layperson is lacking either permanently, as in the case of an Nicantaka, or at least temporarily. This isn't a context in which we can really discuss the lay-monastic divide, though, because, in a very pragmatic sense, its reality is a matter of faith, of monks and lay people defining themselves in contrast to each other rather than independently of each other, or the texts using that as an encouragement to get people to renounce. In other words, they could be harping on the good qualities of monastics as a means of trying to convince lay people of renouncing. For a modern and somewhat cynical analog, if you go to somebody and convincingly say, really amazing, awesome, compassionate, intelligent, mindful people buy this brand of paper towels, you're more likely to get a sale, even if the person did not need paper towels. And the final part that underlies all of this is that faith and identity are all individual experiences, and it's really hard to diagnose those in large groups, because it's just going to vary person to person.
How does this difference affect duties and roles?
One thing I mentioned earlier is this idea that there is a two-way transactional relationship between lay people and monks. This is not at all a bad or cynical thing. It is perfectly okay for there to be a mutual social agreement between two parties like this. I provide material subsistence in return for religious subsistence. In communities that believe in the truth and reality of religious subsistence as much as the material subsistence, this is a mutually beneficial trade-off. The monastics are regarded as performing spiritual work and toil for the sake of the continuation of the Dharma, and the lay people give some of the fruits of their physical and material labor to support them. Along the way, everybody generates merit, which leads to a happy rebirth. In this system, monastics have a responsibility to uphold the cosmic order, whereas the lay people must uphold the social or the worldly order. These are equally important. The cosmic order must be upheld to prevent calamities such as natural disasters, famine, pestilence, plague, etc. If this cosmic order fails, then the social order could fail. The social or worldly order must be upheld to allow the monastics to continue to exist, to protect them, and to encourage people to continue to engage with them. Because of the nature of these two duties, the monastics and lay people are mandated to live separately from each other while still being reliant on each other. Monastics are allowed to live outside of the social order because they are regarded as being unable to uphold the cosmic order from within the social order. That's why there are all these 227 or 311 rules they follow. These rules extricate them from the social order as much as possible, and they all pertain to the maintenance of this cosmic order. The lay people can cross the divide when they renounce, but for the most part their responsibility is to live their lives and maintain the social order to, again, reinforce the continued support and protection of the monastics and the cosmic order. This is a historically old way of understanding the functions and purposes of the laity and the monastics, but it holds fairly true in principle for most of Buddhism. This question also pertains to the performance of rituals. The role that laity play in Buddhist rituals can often go farther, benefiting from merit-generated or generous almsgiving. Many Buddhist rituals serve tons of symbolic purposes at one time, as in the case of the sutta reading example that I gave earlier. That ritual would usually be performed at a temple, where there is an icon of the Buddha to bow in front of, where there is a place to offer incense, where there is a place to copy the sutra that's being recited, etc. Rituals thus give occasion for the lay practitioners to establish the foundations of their relationship with the Buddha. They're able to make offerings of incense, food, or water to the statue of the Buddha. They're able to copy the sutra. They're able to recite lines of the sutra that entail pledging oneself to the Buddha for this life and all lives after until enlightenment. I bring this up because these parts of the ritual do not fall into the category of feeding or supporting the monastic community. The monastic community doesn't eat what people offer to the Buddha, nor do they get any material benefit from the layperson pledging themselves as a disciple of the Buddha or copying the sutra or whatever else. In that context, the role of the monastics is to open the door, to create the opportunity and foster the moment for the layperson to hitch on to the Dharma so that they may renounce in the future of this life or the next. My current Buddhist temple has a ritual where they chant a sutra in Kanbun, or Japanese readings of classical Chinese, and some English speakers have asked, "What are we supposed to do while we chant? I don't understand any of what you're saying, so I can't actively listen and understand." And the monk has said, "The important part is that you're here. You can let the sounds and the words wash over you and through you while you offer incense, food, water, or money." This tells me that part of the purpose of the reading is to open the door for somebody and create a connection to the Buddha. This difference makes sense because the meaning and the contents of the sutra are initiatory in the context of Shingon Buddhism, meaning that lay people aren't supposed to know them, which we will discuss in the next question. So when the sutta is being recited according to their role, they're not supposed to know what's being said and what is going on. Similar to how in Catholic Mass, lay people aren't expected to understand the Latin that's being spoken.
How does this difference shift and change over time?
Having already discussed the early Buddhist and Theravada distinctions, we can move on to the Mahayana and the esoteric. In Mahayana Buddhism, the distinction between monastic and lay people becomes hazier and less distinct in some areas, but more vivid and stark in others. Lay people and monastics alike are still held to the standard of the 10 precepts, but for monastics, the hundreds of Vinaya rules become ever more relaxed. However, the depth and extent to which the 10 precepts must be followed by monastic people is much deeper than for lay people, because of the advent of the Bodhisattva path. The Bodhisattva path, if you remember, advocates that the highest ideal for the practitioner is the salvation of all sentient beings. Monastics are responsible for accomplishing that. The religious burden they take up is the salvation of literally every sentient being, which they accomplish through their ritual work as a monastic. Instead of following 227 or 311 rules for monks and nuns, they accomplish that work through skillful means. The ethical rules they follow, such as the 10 precepts, are not necessarily requirements that they have to spend a lot of exertion to follow. Instead, they are reflections of being so advanced on the Bodhisattva path that they are willing to ordain and willing to devote their entire lives to such a noble cause as the salvation of all sentient beings. According to this paradigm, lay people are the receivers of this salvation work. It is very much like the shepherd and the flock model of monastic versus lay roles. So, obviously, nonviolence, right speech, and right thoughts are mandated and enforced among Mahayana monastics, but they are allowed to take a boat ride with a nun. They're allowed to own items other than a robe and bowl, and they're allowed to keep and store food or seeds for food crops when they weren't allowed to do all of this before. This is very complicated, though. Some Mahayana schools, like Pure Land, regard enlightenment and moral perfection as being the ideal, but as being more difficult than everybody thinks. Because we are in the absolute worst possible, most difficult time to try to become enlightened. We are in what they call Mappo, or the third and final stage of the Dharma. The first stage of the Dharma is while the Buddha is alive. The second is for the first 500 years after he's died. The third age is all the time between that and when the teachings are completely forgotten. In the first age, dukkha and attachments are relatively low. People become enlightened easily and quickly. In the second age, the teaching is remembered pretty correctly, but it is harder to reach enlightenment than before because of dukkha and attachments increasing in frequency and severity, and because the Buddha is not around to teach us and guide us. In the final age, Mappo, the teaching is not remembered correctly for the most part. Dukkha and attachments are at their highest, and it is hardest to reach enlightenment. We're basically stuck in the spin down of the Dharma wheel until Maitreya comes back and starts us back up with the first age again. In light of this, our inability to achieve true moral perfection by our own power is acknowledged. Thus, monks and nuns are allowed to marry, eat meat, own things, have other jobs, and be almost like everybody else, except for the fact that they are ordained. Because of this, Pure Land monastic rituals are about expressing or cultivating faith that a Mita or another Buddha will take care of things for us. In that regard, monastics and laypeople are all working toward the same goal from the same side. In Vajrayana, this Mappo stuff is generally regarded as not true, but early Buddhist morality is still questioned and challenged. Because of the universal inclusivity of Shingon and Vajrayana, by extension, even evil beings and evil things are regarded as potentially enlightened, enlightening, enlightenable, etc. This doesn't mean that people should be less moral, but it validates immorality as an important potential window into enlightenment. The result is very similar to the Pure Land outlook I described a moment ago. Monastics are able to marry, eat meat, and drink alcohol, putting monastics and laypeople on very similar levels. The difference arises in that skillful means and inclusivity are taken to very extreme ends. Monastics, or otherwise pursuers of the Bodhisattva path, are implored to use anything and everything in their arsenal to bring beings to enlightenment. In that sense, the ends justify the means. If being evil is what it takes to show people what not to do, then that is validated insofar as it is necessary. The reason is because all of reality, even the immoral and evil parts, are regarded as being Dainichi himself, and he is trying to enlighten us at all times. Therefore, he is using everything in his arsenal, and monastics are mandated to do the same. In this scheme, the laypeople are still recipients of that work, but they are also empowered to do it themselves. In the 70s and before, scholars from the West looked at early Buddhism and Mahayana and understood the advent of Mahayana as the great democratization of Buddhism. Before, the path of enlightenment was only for those select few who could renounce and who could live the difficult life according to the 227 or 311 rules for monks and nuns. Then with the advent of Mahayana, householders could pursue that path as well without having to give up their whole lives. This is a problematic interpretation for a lot of reasons, but it speaks to the shift in the boundary that distinguishes monastics and laypeople. As history progresses and Buddhism develops, the roles and traits of the laypeople and monastics cosmologically, ritualistically, and doctrinally become ever closer, ever more similar, and less concerned with early Buddhist monastic rules.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on lay and monastic Buddhism. Thanks again to Garret for being such an engaged listener. Join us next week, where we will discuss Buddhism and Japanese imperialism during World War II. What is the relationship between Japanese imperialism and Japanese Buddhism? Why were Buddhist temples pro-empire? What are their stances today? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and would like to support us, we ask that you instead send that generous support to a worthy cause.
Currently, that is easing the weaponized famine that is tearing through Gaza. Because of blockades, charities and aid organizations can't do much. The best we can do is directly donate to GoFundMe campaigns or the like. For now, we're pointing at the page for Tashneem Mahmood, a mother of 3 who has lost her apartment in the bombing. If you are able, please send some support her way.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.